Some secrets don't rest easy in the ground. They wait in the quiet corners of old barns, hidden beneath dust and time. When 60-year-old cowboy Levi Boone returned to his grandfather's Wyoming ranch to settle the estate, he expected sadness, memories, and maybe a few rusted tools. What he found under 2 canvas covers in that old barn would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family. 2 hand-carved caskets, letters addressed to people who never existed, and a name, Clara, the sister he never knew he had. His grandfather had kept this secret for half a century, taking it nearly to the grave. What happened to Clara? And why did Grandpa hide her existence from everyone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck rattled over the cattle guard just as the sun broke over the Absaroka Range, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and rose. Levi Boone shifted in the driver's seat, his weathered hands tight on the wheel, and felt the familiar weight of homecoming settle in his chest. 3 days had passed since they'd lowered Grandpa James into the cold March ground. 3 days since Levi had stood alone at the graveside, while the wind howled down from the mountains and made the preacher's words scatter like dried leaves. Now he was back at the ranch, and the silence was different, heavier, more permanent. The old Boone property sprawled across 200 acres of high plains grassland, backed up against foothills that rose like stone sentinels toward the Continental Divide. The house itself was a 2-story clapboard affair, painted white once upon a time, but weathered now to the color of old bone. The barn stood 50 yards distant, massive red, its roof sagging slightly in the middle from 90 years of snow and wind. Outbuildings dotted the property, a chicken coop long empty, a smokehouse, a machine shed with its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Levi parked the truck beside the house and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, he could see the front porch where he'd spent countless summer evenings as a boy, listening to Grandpa's stories about working cattle in the 50s and 60s, back when ranching still meant something in these parts. Back before subdivisions and tourism and all the rest of it crept in from the valleys. The passenger door of the trailer behind him creaked open, and Dusty backed out with practiced ease. A 15-year-old quarter horse with a coat the color of wheat chaff and eyes that held more understanding than most people Levi knew. The horse shook himself, surveyed the property, then walked over to the water trough by the barn as if he'd been here 1,000 times before. "Make yourself at home," Levi called out, and the absurdity of talking to a horse made him smile for the first time in days. He climbed out of the truck, his knees protesting the long drive from Montana, where he'd been working a cattle operation through the winter. 60 years old, and some mornings he felt every one of them in his joints and bones. Other mornings he felt no different than he had at 30. Today was somewhere in between. The air smelled like sage and cold earth, the particular scent of early spring in Wyoming when the snow has melted, but the ground hasn't quite decided to wake up yet. Levi stood in the yard and let his eyes travel over the property, cataloguing what needed doing. The fence along the south pasture sagged. The barn doors hung askew. The windmill pump wasn't turning, which meant the bearing had probably seized up again. A lifetime of work stared back at him, but he only had 3 weeks before the auction. 3 weeks to sort through 90 years of accumulated life and decide what mattered and what didn't. The lawyer in town, a young fellow named Peterson who couldn't have been more than 35, had been clear about the situation. Grandpa's will left everything to Levi, the land, the buildings, whatever was in the house and barn, but also the debts. Medical bills from the last 2 years, property taxes in arrears, a second mortgage Grandpa had taken out a decade back and never quite paid off. Peterson's advice had been simple: sell it all, pay off what was owed, take whatever was left and move on. Sound advice, probably. Levi had no ties here anymore. His ex-wife was somewhere in Oregon with a man who sold insurance. No kids, no siblings. His mother had died 32 years ago, cancer, quick and mean, and his father followed her 6 years later. Grandpa James had been the last thread connecting Levi to anything resembling family, and now that thread was cut. The house key was under the third flower pot on the porch. Same place it had been since Levi was 12 years old. Some things never changed. He unlocked the door and stepped into the dim interior, immediately hit by the smell of old coffee and wood smoke, and something else, the particular scent of an old man living alone. Not unpleasant, just sad in a way Levi couldn't quite articulate. The front room looked exactly as he remembered from his last visit 2 Christmases ago. Grandpa's recliner by the wood stove, worn smooth in the seat. The television on a stand in the corner probably hadn't worked in 5 years. Photographs on the mantel above the stove, mostly of Levi at various ages, a few of his parents, and grainy black and white of Grandpa as a young man standing beside an old Ford pickup. Levi moved through the house slowly, reacquainting himself with the layout. Kitchen with its ancient gas stove and harvest gold refrigerator that hummed too loud. Dining room table covered in unopened mail and old newspapers. Bathroom with cracked linoleum and a tub ring that would take a week to scrub out. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, Grandpa's, a guest room that had been Levi's during summer visits, and a smaller room at the end of the hall that had always been kept locked. He tried the handle of that third door out of habit. Still locked. He'd asked about it once as a kid, and Grandpa had said it was just storage, nothing interesting, and changed the subject so firmly that Levi never asked again. Back downstairs, Levi found himself standing at the mantel, looking at the photographs. His mother smiled out from a frame, young and pretty, maybe 20 years old in the picture. He'd inherited her dark hair and high cheekbones, though his eyes came from his father's side, pale blue, almost grey in certain light. She'd been a quiet woman, his mother, reserved. Sometimes Levi had caught her staring out windows with an expression he couldn't read, like she was looking for something that never quite appeared. Next to her photograph sat a pocket watch on a small wooden stand. Levi picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Silver, tarnished now, but still beautiful. He pressed the catch and the cover snapped open, revealing a white face with Roman numerals and hands frozen at 347. On the inside of the cover, an inscription, "To James with love, Margaret, 1952. Margaret, Grandpa's wife, Levi's grandmother, though she died long before he was born. Grandpa never talked about her much, just said she'd been taken too young and left it at that. This watch was one of the few physical reminders that she'd existed at all. Levi closed the watch and set it back on the mantel, then walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water from the tap. The pipes groaned, but the water ran clear enough. He drank, standing at the sink, looking out the window toward the barn. That's where the real work waited. 90 years of tools and equipment and God knew what else, all of it needing to be sorted, catalogued, sold or hauled away. He'd start tomorrow, first light. Tonight he'd sleep in his old bedroom upstairs and try not to think too hard about the fact that he was alone in a house full of ghosts. He spent the remaining daylight hours unloading his gear from the truck and getting Dusty settled in one of the barn stalls with feed and fresh water. The barn's interior was dark and cavernous, smelling of old hay and motor oil and time itself. He didn't explore much. Just got the horse squared away and headed back to the house as the sun sank behind the mountains and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Supper was a can of chili heated on the stove, eaten standing up while looking at those photographs on the mantel. His mother, his grandfather as a young man, and nowhere in any frame any picture of Margaret. Just her name inscribed in a pocket watch and a grave in town that Levi had never visited. He realized, standing there with an empty bowl in his hands, how little he actually knew about his family. His mother had been an only child, or so he'd always been told. She'd grown up in Montana, met his father at a county fair, married young. That was the story. Simple, uncomplicated. But now, in this house that held more silence than sound, Levi wondered what else had gone unspoken. What other stories had died with the people who could tell them? Sleep came hard that night. The bed in his old room felt too small, the house too quiet. Every creak of settling wood sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the windows felt like someone trying to get in, or maybe trying to get out. At some point past midnight, Levi gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make coffee. While it brewed, he found himself at the mantel again, picking up that pocket watch. He wound it carefully, and to his surprise, the mechanism caught, and the second hand began to tick. The sound filled the quiet room, steady, relentless, measuring out moments that couldn't be taken back. He stood there for a long time, watching the hands move, thinking about his grandfather lying alone in that house for the last 10 years, thinking about all the things they'd never talked about, all the questions he'd never thought to ask. The watch ticked on, counting down towards something Levi couldn't yet see, but sensed was coming. Some revelation waiting for him in the dark corners of this place. Some truth that had been buried so long it had become part of the foundation. He reset the watch to midnight, as good a time as any to start over, and placed it back on the mantel. Then he took his coffee to the porch and sat in the cold dark, waiting for the sun to rise and give him light enough to start sorting through the wreckage of a life. Dusty nickered softly from the barn, a sound of comfort in the vast Wyoming night, and Levi sat and waited, and tried not to think about locked doors and missing photographs and names inscribed in silver that no one ever spoke aloud. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that made you grateful for hot coffee and the promise of work to warm your bones. Levi was up before the sun, standing in the barn doorway with steam rising from his cup, looking at the mountain of work ahead of him. The barn was a repository of decades. Farm equipment from the 40s sat beside power tools from the 80s. Coils of barbed wire hung on walls next to halters and bridles cracked with age. Wooden crates were stacked 10 high in some corners, their contents long forgotten. An old International Harvester tractor rusted peacefully near the back, its tires flat, its engine seized. This wasn't going to be a 3-week job. This was a 3-month job, minimum. But 3 weeks was all he had, so Levi set his coffee aside, pulled on his work gloves, and got started. He worked methodically, starting near the front and moving back. Anything obviously worthless went into a pile for the burn barrel. Anything that might have value, old tools, decent lumber, salvageable hardware, got sorted into the bed of the truck for eventual sale. It was mindless work, the kind that let thoughts wander while the body stayed busy. Dusty watched from his stall, occasionally offering commentary in the form of soft wickers and head tosses. The horse had become Levi's most constant companion over the past dozen years, acquired as a 3-year-old from a ranch in Montana that was going under. They'd worked cattle together, crossed mountain passes in snow and heat, spent more nights under stars than Levi cared to count. If you'd asked him to name his closest friend, he'd have said the horse without hesitation or shame. By noon, Levi had cleared maybe 1/10 of the barn's interior. His back ached, his hands were filthy despite the gloves, and he was pretty sure he'd breathed in enough dust to cough for a week. He took a break, sitting on an overturned bucket and eating a sandwich he'd made that morning. White bread, bologna, mustard. The same lunch Grandpa used to pack for him during those summer visits 30 years ago. The far corner of the barn remained shrouded in shadow, even with the doors wide open. Something about it made Levi hesitate. Maybe it was the way the dust patterns suggested that corner hadn't been disturbed in years. Maybe it was the 2 large shapes covered by canvas tarps, sitting there like monuments to something best left alone. But hesitation never got work done. So after finishing his sandwich, Levi stood and walked back to that corner. The tarps were heavy canvas, the kind that used to be army surplus. They'd been secured with rope at the corners and were covered in a layer of dust so thick it puffed up in clouds when Levi touched them. Whatever was underneath hadn't been looked at in a very long time. He untied the first tarp and pulled it away. The object underneath stopped him cold. It was a casket, pine by the look of it, hand-carved with a skill that surprised him. Flowers had been etched into the wood, roses maybe or peonies, their petals rendered in careful detail. The casket was small, child-sized, maybe 4 feet long, if that. Levi stood there staring, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. Why would his grandfather have a casket in the barn? A child's casket at that? Had he made it for someone? Sold caskets as a side business? That didn't make any sense. Grandpa had been a rancher, not a carpenter. His hands were shaking slightly as he moved to the second tarp and pulled it away. Another casket. This one full-sized, maybe 6 feet long. Also pine, also hand-carved, with the same careful attention to detail. The wood had darkened with age, but the craftsmanship remained evident. These weren't store-bought. Someone had made them by hand, spent hours with saw and chisel and sandpaper to create something beautiful and terrible. Levi became aware that his heart was beating too fast. The barn suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Dusty shifted in his stall, sensing his human's distress. There were no bodies in these caskets. They couldn't be. They were just, storage? Some kind of strange memorial? He needed to open them, needed to know what was inside. But the thought of lifting those lids made his stomach clench. He forced himself to move, reached down, found the seam where the lid of the smaller casket met the base. It wasn't nailed shut, just resting in place. He lifted it. Inside was a life compressed into objects. A rag doll lay in the center, its fabric faded but still recognizable. Calico dress, yellow yarn hair, button eyes. Someone had embroidered a name on the dress hem. Clara. Next to the doll, a pair of baby shoes, white leather turned yellow with age. A silver cross on a delicate chain. A small wooden horse hand-carved. A collection of ribbons, the kind children won at county fairs for best pig or best calf. And letters. Dozens of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon. Levi picked up one of the letters with trembling fingers. The envelope was addressed in strong masculine handwriting. My dearest Clara. He slid the letter out, careful, so careful the paper was so old, and began to read. My dearest Clara. Tonight I'm writing to tell you about the stars. You always loved the stars, remember? How we'd sit on the porch, and I'd point out Orion and Cassiopeia and the Big Dipper, and you'd make me tell you the stories behind them over and over. Tonight, I looked up at those same stars, and I thought about how they're still shining even though you're gone, and that gave me some small comfort. Your mother says I shouldn't write these letters, that it's not healthy, but I can't help it. I need to talk to you, even if you can't answer. I need to tell you about the stars. It was signed, All My Love, Dad. Levi's hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped the letter. He set it down carefully and picked up another envelope. Same handwriting. My dearest Clara again. He opened it. My dearest Clara, spring came today, and with it the calves. 14 new babies, all healthy, all beautiful. You would have loved naming them. You always insisted every calf needed a proper name, not just a number. Do you remember the little black one from 2 years ago? You called her Midnight Princess. She's a mama herself now. Levi couldn't read anymore. His vision was blurring. He set the letter down and backed away from the casket, his breath coming short and fast. Clara. His grandfather had written letters to someone named Clara, a child named Clara, who had loved stars and calves, and apparently had died young enough to fit in a 4-foot casket. Who was she? He turned to the larger casket, driven now by a need to understand that overrode his fear. This lid came up just as easily, revealing another collection of memories. Women's things this time. A wedding ring, a brush with long dark hair still tangled in the bristles. More letters, hundreds of them. And a leather-bound journal with a name stamped on the cover in gold. Margaret Boone. Margaret. Grandpa's wife. Levi's grandmother. His hands moved of their own accord, pulling out a photograph from the stack in the casket. Black and white, the edges scalloped in that old-fashioned way. It showed a young woman, beautiful with dark hair and a smile that lit up her whole face. She was holding a baby, and beside her stood a man Levi recognized even through the decades. Grandpa James, much younger, his face unlined and full of joy. Levi turned the photograph over. On the back, in feminine handwriting, Margaret, James, and our little Sarah, March 1952. Sarah, not Clara, Sarah. He dug deeper into the casket, pulling out more photographs. Here was the same woman with two little girls, maybe 5 or 6 years old, both wearing identical dresses. Here was the whole family standing in front of this very barn. He stopped. The photograph in his hand showed the two little girls side by side, mirror images of each other, identical. Twins on the back, Clara and Sarah, summer 1957, our blessings. Twins, Clara and Sarah. Levi's mind was racing now, trying to piece together what he was seeing. Grandpa had twin daughters, Clara and Sarah. Clara had died. That much was clear from the letters and the small casket. But Sarah? Who was Sarah? The barn seemed to tilt around him. He sat down hard on the dusty floor, photographs scattered around him, and tried to breathe through the tightness in his chest. His mother had been an only child. That's what he'd always been told. She'd grown up in Montana with her aunt after her mother died young. That was the story, but what if it wasn't the whole story? What if his mother had been a twin? What if she'd had a sister who died, and no one ever told him? The questions were coming too fast now, piling up like snow in a blizzard. Why keep these caskets hidden in the barn? Why not talk about Clara? Why hide this entire chapter of the family's history? And the biggest question of all, the one that made Levi's hands shake and his heart pound, was simple and terrible. Who exactly was his mother? He looked down at the photograph in his hands. 2 identical little girls, smiling at the camera, their whole lives ahead of them, neither knowing that one would be gone within a year and the other would be lost in a different way. The dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon sunlight coming through the barn door. Dusty nickered softly, and Levi Boone sat among his grandfather's secrets, holding photographs of people he should have known about but didn't, and felt the foundation of his life begin to crack. Levi didn't go back to the house until well after dark. He sat on the barn floor until the light faded and his legs went numb, reading letter after letter by the glow of his phone's flashlight. When that battery died, he carried the caskets to the house, one at a time, reverently, as if they held something more fragile than old paper and faded photographs. He set them on the dining room table, cleared away Grandpa's mail and newspapers, and spread everything out under the harsh kitchen light. Then he made a pot of coffee and settled in for what he knew would be a long night. The letters from Grandpa to Clara numbered in the dozens. They spanned years, 1958 to 1960 mostly, and chronicled the daily life of a rancher talking to his deceased daughter. He told her about the cattle, the weather, the changing seasons. He told her about missing her laugh, her questions, the way she used to follow him around the barn, asking why about everything. The letters were heartbreaking in their mundane specificity. This wasn't a man trying to process grief through poetry or philosophy. This was a father so broken by loss that he kept talking to his child as if she might still hear him. One letter in particular made Levi have to set down his coffee and walk away for a moment. My dearest Clara, your mother is very sick now. The doctors say it won't be long. I find myself angry at God in a way I've never been before. Wasn't it enough to take you? Must he take her too? Your sister doesn't understand what's happening. She asks for you every night before bed. She asks when you're coming back. I don't know how to make her understand that you're not coming back. I don't know how to make myself understand it either. Levi returned to the table, his throat tight. He picked up the journal, Margaret's journal, and opened it to the first page. January 1st, 1952. A new year and a new life inside me. The doctor confirmed today that I'm carrying twins. Twins! James nearly fainted when I told him. We're going to have 2 babies, 2 little lives to raise and love and guide. I pray I'm strong enough. I pray I'm wise enough. I pray God gives me the years to see them grown. He read on, skipping through pages, watching Margaret's handwriting change from neat and careful to increasingly shaky as the years progressed. She wrote about the birth, difficult, both girls small but healthy. She wrote about their first year, the sleepless nights, the joy of watching them grow. She wrote about their personalities emerging, Clara bold and fearless, Sarah cautious and sweet. June 12th, 1957. Clara fell from the fence today trying to ride a calf like a horse. Scraped her knee badly, but was laughing even as I cleaned the wound. Sarah stood beside her the whole time, holding her hand, not saying a word, but sharing her sister's pain in that way they have. I don't understand how they communicate sometimes. It's like they're connected by invisible threads, each feeling what the other feels. James says it's a twin thing. I think it's something more. I think it's love in its purest form. Levi turned more pages, faster now, looking for the moment when things changed. He found it in the fall of 1957. October 3rd, 1957. Clara has been running a fever for 3 days now. The doctor came out yesterday and says it's just a flu bug going around. But something feels wrong. A mother knows. Sarah hasn't left her sister's side. She sleeps in Clara's bed, holds her hand, whispers to her. James says I'm worrying over nothing. I hope he's right. The entries after that became increasingly frantic. Fever that wouldn't break. Doctors who couldn't explain what was wrong. Medicines that didn't help. And through it all, Margaret's growing certainty that she was losing her daughter. February 6, 1958. Clara passed this morning in my arms. Sarah held her hand. She was 6 years old. 6 years, 9 months, and 18 days. The doctor says it was some kind of blood disease, something they couldn't diagnose in time. But what does it matter now? My baby is gone. James won't speak. He just sits in the barn, working on something with his hands. Sarah asks when Clara is coming back, and I don't have words to tell her. How do you explain death to a 6-year-old? How do you explain that her other half is gone forever? Levi closed the journal and pressed his palms against his eyes. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, the silence pressed down like a weight. He forced himself to continue searching through the caskets. At the bottom of the larger one, beneath all the letters and photographs, he found a manila envelope. It had been sealed, but the glue had long since dried and cracked. Inside were official documents, birth certificates, medical records, a death certificate. He pulled out the first birth certificate and held it under the light. Birth certificate. State of Wyoming. Female. Born March 15, 1952. At 3:47 a.m. Name, Clara May Boone. Parents, James Robert Boone and Margaret Ann Boone. Notes, Twin B. Twin B. Levi set it down and reached for the second certificate, knowing what he would find, but needing to see it anyway. Birth certificate. State of Wyoming. Female. Born March 15, 1952. At 3:22 a.m. Name, Sarah May Boone. Parents, James Robert Boone and Margaret Ann Boone. Notes, Twin A. Sarah May Boone. He sat back in his chair, staring at the name. His mother's name had been Sarah Hartwell, supposedly raised by her aunt in Montana after her mother died. But her original name had been Sarah Boone. She hadn't been raised by a distant aunt. She'd been raised by her mother's sister after being given away by a father who couldn't bear to look at her because she reminded him of Clara. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so sad it made Levi want to howl at the moon. His mother had been Clara's twin. She'd survived whatever disease took her sister, and then she'd been given away, sent to Montana to live with relatives, because Grandpa couldn't separate the two girls in his mind. Looking at Sarah meant seeing Clara's absence. Raising Sarah meant confronting his grief every single day, so he'd sent her away, protected himself from the pain, and apparently never told anyone the truth. Levi stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark shape of the barn, silhouetted against the stars. Those same stars Grandpa had written to Clara about. Those same stars that had watched this family tear itself apart in the wake of tragedy. Questions flooded his mind. Did his mother know? Had anyone ever told her about Clara? About being a twin? About the sister she'd lost at age 6? He didn't think so. She would have said something. She would have told him. Wouldn't she? But then again, his whole family seemed built on silence, on things not said, on secrets buried so deep they became part of the foundation. He returned to the table and began looking through the photographs more carefully. Here was one of the twins as babies, impossible to tell apart. Here was one from their first birthday, both girls with cake on their faces. Here was one from Christmas 1956, both holding dolls. Here was the last one, summer 1957, both girls standing in front of the barn, squinting into the sun, holding hands. Levi turned it over. Margaret's handwriting, last day before Clara got sick. Thank you, God, for this perfect afternoon. There were no photographs of Sarah after that. As if she'd disappeared along with her twin. As if the whole family had ceased to exist the day Clara died. He found the death certificate at the bottom of the stack. Clara May Boone died February 2nd, 1958, age 6 years. Cause, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a child's disease. Brutal and fast. No wonder the doctors hadn't known what was wrong until it was too late. Levi gathered all the documents and stacked them carefully. His mind was reeling, but underneath the shock was growing anger. Anger at Grandpa for keeping this secret. Anger at his mother for never searching for her past. Anger at himself for never asking the right questions. But underneath the anger was something else. Something that felt like understanding, though he didn't want to admit it. Because what would he have done in Grandpa's place? How do you raise a child when every time you look at her you see the ghost of the one you lost? How do you function through that kind of grief? Maybe you don't. Maybe you make impossible choices and then spend the rest of your life carving caskets by hand and writing letters to the dead and keeping secrets so heavy they crush you flat. He looked at the pocket watch on the mantel, ticking away in the silence. 3:47, the time Clara was born. The time Grandpa had set it to before he died. Everything meant something. Every object in this house was a memorial. And Levi Boone, standing in his grandfather's kitchen at 2 in the morning, realized he'd never really known his family at all. Morning came with the kind of clarity that follows a sleepless night spent unraveling your own history. Levi hadn't bothered going to bed. He'd sat at the dining table until dawn broke over the mountains, reading and rereading the letters, studying the photographs, trying to piece together a past that had been deliberately hidden from him. By 7, he'd made a decision. He needed to talk to people who'd known Grandpa back in the 50s and 60s. Someone in town had to remember Margaret, remember the twins, remember what happened. Clearwater was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, even business from 70 years ago. He saddled Dusty and rode into town rather than driving. It gave him time to think, to prepare what he'd say. The horse moved with steady patience along the county road, past ranches where Levi could see folks already at their morning chores. Smoke rose from chimneys. Cattle grazed in pastures. Life continued the way it always had out here. Regardless of what secrets the past held, Clearwater hadn't changed much since Levi was a boy. Main Street still had the same false front buildings, the same general store, the same diner with its faded sign. The population sign on the edge of town read 847, same as it had 30 years ago. People moved away, people died, new babies were born. But somehow the number stayed constant, as if the town itself had decided this was the right size and refused to grow or shrink beyond it. He hitched Dusty outside the general store and went in, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The interior was dim and smelled of coffee and aged wood. 3 old men sat at a table near the pot-bellied stove. There was always a group of old men at that table. Had been for as long as Levi could remember, though the faces changed as years passed. The woman behind the counter was Betty Knowles, who'd been running the store since her husband died back in the 90s. She looked up from the newspaper she'd been reading and gave him a nod. Levi Boone, heard you were back in town. Sorry about your grandpa. Appreciate that, Mrs. Knowles. Come to settle the estate. Working on it. She studied him with eyes that missed nothing. You look like you've been up all night. Coffee's fresh if you want some. He poured himself a cup and stood there for a moment, gathering his courage. The 3 old men were watching him now. Their conversation paused. He recognized one of them. Walter Hayes had to be over 80 now, weathered as a fence post and twice as stubborn. Walter had ranched the property next to Grandpa's back in the day. Levi walked over to their table. Morning, Mr. Hayes. Levi. Walter nodded. Your grandpa was a good man. We'll miss him at the coffee club. Thank you. I wonder if I could ask you something. About the old days, I mean. Walter's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. What about them? Did you know my grandmother? Margaret. The silence that fell over the table was immediate and heavy. The other two men looked at Walter, then at each other, then found reasons to study their coffee cups. Walter took a long moment before answering. I knew her. Fine woman. Died too young, like a lot of folks back then. Did you know about her daughters? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walter's jaw tightened. Levi, some things are best left buried. Your grandpa had his reasons for not talking about the past. I found their caskets in the barn. The letters, the photographs. Clara and Sarah. I need to know what happened. One of the other men stood abruptly. Got to get home. Nice seeing you, Levi. He was out the door before anyone could respond. Walter sighed and gestured to the empty chair. Sit down, son, Levi sat. Walter stared into his coffee for a long time before speaking. I wasn't here when it happened. I'd taken my family down to Denver for the winter, helped my brother with his business. But I heard about it when we got back in spring of '58. Everyone heard about it. Little Clara died of some kind of blood disease. Fast and mean, the way childhood diseases were back then. Margaret fell apart. James tried to hold things together, but he was drowning. Then Margaret got cancer. Stress can do that, the old folks said, and she was gone, within a year of Clara dying. What about Sarah? Walter's face closed up. That's family business, Levi. I'm family. I'm asking. The old man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. Sarah got sent to Montana to live with Margaret's sister. James couldn't handle raising her on his own, and I think this is just what people said, mind you. I think looking at her reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Twins, you know, identical. Hard to look at one without seeing the other. Did anyone ever hear from her again? From Sarah? Not that I know of. She was gone, and that was that. James never spoke of her. Never spoke of any of it. Closed that door and locked it tight. Walter's eyes were sad. Man's entitled to his grief, Levi, even if the way he grieves doesn't make sense to the rest of us. Levi stood. Thank you for telling me. Where are you going now? Library. Then the cemetery, Walter nodded. You're going to find more questions than answers, son. Sometimes that's all there is. The library was a small building next to the post office. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, was a fixture of Clearwater. She'd been running the place since before Levi was born. She looked up from her desk when he entered and gave him a warm smile. Levi Boone, I heard you were back. How can I help you? I need to look at old newspapers. From 1958, 1959. Something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. The microfilm is in back. I'll set you up. She led him to a small room with an ancient microfilm reader and showed him how to load the reels. What are you looking for specifically? Anything about the Boone family. My grandmother Margaret, her daughters. Mrs. Chen's expression grew sad. Oh, honey, that was before my time here, but I've heard the story. Terrible tragedy. Your grandfather never recovered. What story? The little girl who died, and then the mother dying so soon after. People said James Boone aged 20 years in one winter. She paused. There was another daughter, you know, a twin, but she was sent away after the mother passed. Folks thought it was for the best. Did anyone ever question that decision? Question it? This was Wyoming in 1959, Levi. People minded their own business. A man's family was his own concern. She touched his shoulder gently. I hope you find what you're looking for. He spent 2 hours going through the microfilm, his eyes aching from the fuzzy print. He found Margaret's obituary first. Margaret Ann Boone, 31, died January 27, 1959, at Clearwater Memorial Hospital after a brief illness. She is survived by her husband, James Robert Boone. Services will be held Friday at Clearwater Community Church. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the American Cancer Society. No mention of children, no mention of Sarah. It was as if Clara and Sarah had never existed. He found a brief mention of Clara's death in the February 1958 paper. Just a notice, really. Clara Boone, daughter of James and Margaret Boone, age 6, died February 2nd at home. Private services were held, nothing else. No details, no story. Just a name and a date, as if that was all a life amounted to. The cemetery was on the east edge of town, surrounded by a low stone wall that was slowly crumbling. Levi walked among the headstones until he found what he was looking for. Margaret Rose Boone, 1928-1959, beloved wife. The stone was simple, granite, weathered by 70 years of wind and snow. Someone, Grandpa presumably, had planted roses nearby, though they'd long since gone wild. No one had tended this grave in years. Levi stood there for a long time, looking at the words carved in stone. Beloved wife, not mother. The absence felt deliberate, like one more way of erasing what had happened, of pretending the daughters had never existed, but they had existed. Clara and Sarah had been real. They'd laughed and played and loved each other the way sisters do. One had died too young. The other had been sent away. And now, 70 years later, Levi stood at their mother's grave and tried to understand the choices that had been made in the wake of unbearable loss. He pulled the faded photograph from his pocket, the one he'd found in the casket. Margaret with both girls, all three of them smiling, happiness captured in black and white. He'd brought it thinking he might leave it at the grave, but now he couldn't. This photograph was evidence that his family had once been whole, that before tragedy struck, there had been love and laughter and hope. He needed to keep it, needed to remember that his mother had once been Sarah Boone, that she'd had a twin sister, that she'd been loved before she'd been sent away. As he walked back to where Dusty waited patiently, Levi made a decision. He was going to find out everything he could about what happened to Sarah after she left Wyoming. He was going to understand why his mother had never spoken of her past, why she'd lived her whole life not knowing she'd been a twin, and somehow he was going to make peace with the fact that his entire family had been built on silence. Back at the ranch, Levi found himself unable to do any of the work he'd come here to do. The barn sat waiting, full of decades of accumulation that needed sorting, but he couldn't bring himself to go back there. Not yet. Instead, he returned to the dining table where Margaret's journal lay open. Its pages yellowed with age, its words a window into a past he was only beginning to understand. He'd read portions of it the night before, but now he settled in to read it properly, from beginning to end. If he was going to understand what happened to his family, he needed to hear it in Margaret's own words. The early entries were full of joy. Margaret wrote about her pregnancy with the casual confidence of a young woman who believed the universe was fundamentally good. She described feeling the babies move, trying to guess which kick belonged to which twin. She wrote about James building cribs in the barn, his excitement and nervousness about becoming a father. March 20th, 1952. The girls are 5 days old, and I'm finally able to write again. The birth was difficult. I'll spare these pages the details, but the moment I heard their cries, everything else fell away. Clara came second, but she made her presence known immediately. Loud and demanding, already certain of what she wants. Sarah is quieter, more watchful. The nurse said twins often have these complementary personalities. I think it's more than that. I think Sarah is just more comfortable observing the world before joining it. Clara, on the other hand, wants to grab life with both hands right from the start. Levi smiled despite himself. Even as infants, the girls had been distinctly themselves. He read on, watching the months and years unfold in Margaret's neat handwriting. First steps, first words, the way they developed their own language that only they understood. The challenges of raising twins, the constant motion, the need to be two places at once. The worry that she couldn't give each girl enough individual attention. December 15, 1953. Today, I watched the girls play in the snow, and I realized something beautiful and terrible. They don't need me the way most children need their mothers. They have each other. They're complete in a way that makes me happy and sad at the same time. When Clara fell and scraped her knee, Sarah ran to her before I could even move. When Sarah woke from a nightmare, Clara was already climbing into her bed, whispering comfort. They're their own little universe, these two. I'm just the satellite orbiting around them, making sure they have food and clean clothes and someone to kiss their foreheads at night. The entries continued. Year after year, painting a picture of a family that was happy despite the hardships of ranch life. Money was tight, but love was abundant. The girls learned to ride, to feed chickens, to help with small chores. They started school, though the teacher complained they wouldn't separate wherever Clara went. Sarah followed, and vice versa. Then came 1957, and the tone of the journal shifted. October 8th, 1957, Clara's fever won't break. It's been 5 days now. The doctor came again yesterday and took more blood for testing. He tried to sound reassuring, but I saw the worry in his eyes. Sarah hasn't left her sister's side. She sleeps in Clara's bed, holds her hand, talks to her constantly. This morning I heard her whispering, "You have to get better. You have to. I can't be just me. We're supposed to be we." Levi had to stop reading for a moment. The love between the girls, the terror of one losing the other, it was almost too much to bear. November 3rd, 1957. The tests came back. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. I had to ask the doctor to write it down because I couldn't remember the words. He explained it's a cancer of the blood, that it's aggressive, that in children it can move very fast. He talked about treatments, but his face said what his mouth didn't. There's nothing we can do that will make a real difference. Not out here, not in 1957, not with the medical knowledge we have. Clara has maybe 6 months, maybe less. The entries after that were shorter, more fragmented, as if Margaret was too exhausted or too grief-stricken to write complete thoughts. November 15th. Clara is getting weaker. She can't keep food down. Sarah won't eat either. Says she's not hungry if Clara can't eat. December 1st. James is building something in the barn. Won't tell me what. I think I know. I don't have the strength to ask. December 25th. Worst Christmas of my life. The girls tried to be cheerful, but Clara fell asleep, opening her first present. Sarah opened the rest for her, describing each gift in detail, so Clara could enjoy them without having to sit up. They're so brave, both of them. Braver than their parents. January 10th, 1958. Clara asked me today if dying hurts. She's 7 years old, and she's asking me if dying hurts. I lied. I said no, it's just like falling asleep. She said good, because she's very tired, and she'd like to sleep for a while. Then she asked if Sarah could come with her. I had to leave the room. Levi's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes roughly and kept reading. February 2nd, 1958. Clara passed this morning in my arms. Sarah held her hand. She was awake and lucid at the end, which the doctor said was a mercy. She told Sarah not to be sad. She said she'd wait for her in heaven, and they'd be together again someday. Sarah asked if she could go now. Could she go with Clara now? And it broke something inside me that I don't think will ever heal. We told her no, she has to stay, she has to live. She said okay, but she looked at us like we'd betrayed her, like we were punishing her by making her stay behind. I don't know how to help her. I don't know how to help any of us. The entries after Clara's death were sporadic and increasingly illegible, as if Margaret's hand shook too much to write clearly. February 10th. Sarah won't speak, won't eat unless we force her. She sleeps in Clara's bed, clutching Clara's doll. The doctor says it's normal grief, but this doesn't feel normal. This feels like she's trying to follow her sister wherever she's gone. March 1. I'm tired all the time. The doctor ran tests. I go back next week for results, but I already know. I can feel it inside me, this wrong thing. Cancer, probably. My body giving up because my heart already has. April 5th. Confirmed. Ovarian cancer advanced. 6 months, maybe a year. I ask them not to tell James yet. I need time to figure out how to say goodbye to my husband and my daughter. How do you prepare a 7-year-old to lose both her sister and her mother within a year? The final entries were the hardest to read. October 20th, 1959. Margaret's sister Elizabeth came today. We've made the decision. Sarah will go to Montana to live with her. It's the right choice. James can barely function. I'm dying. Sarah needs stability, normalcy, a chance to heal. Elizabeth is kind and has no children of her own. She'll give Sarah a good home. A fresh start. Away from this ranch that holds nothing but ghosts. November 1st, 1959. Sarah leaves tomorrow. I tried to explain to her that it's for the best, that Aunt Elizabeth will take good care of her, that she'll have a better life in Montana. She nodded but didn't speak. She hasn't spoken since Clara died. The therapist says she might start talking again once she's in a new environment, away from the reminders. I hope so. I hope she finds her voice again. I hope she finds happiness. I hope she forgives us someday for sending her away. November 2nd, 1959. Sarah is gone. Elizabeth came and took her this morning. She didn't cry, didn't fight, just walked to the car with her little suitcase and got in. Didn't look back. James wouldn't come out of the barn to say goodbye. I think something in him died today, same as something died the day Clara passed. We're all ghosts now, haunting our own lives. That was the last entry. Margaret had died less than 3 months later. Levi closed the journal carefully and sat in the quiet house, listening to the clock tick on the mantel. The pocket watch, set to 3:47 the moment Clara was born. The moment everything began. He understood now why Grandpa had never spoken of the past. How do you talk about losing a daughter to disease, losing a wife to grief and cancer, and sending away your surviving child because you couldn't bear to look at her? How do you live with those choices? How do you wake up every morning knowing what you've done? You don't talk about it. You lock it away. You build caskets to hold the memories because you can't hold them in your heart anymore. You write letters to a dead child because at least the dead can't look at you with accusation. You set a pocket watch to the moment before everything fell apart, and you let it tick away the years, counting down to nothing, and you never, ever tell your grandson the truth. Levi stood and walked to the window. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Dusty was grazing peacefully in the pasture. The barn sat solid and patient, holding its secrets. He thought about his mother, Sarah, though she'd grown up as Sarah Hartwell. Had she remembered Clara? Had she carried that grief her whole life, or had time and distance dulled it? Had she known she was a twin, or had Elizabeth kept that secret too? He'd never know. She was gone, buried in a cemetery 3 counties over, taking her own silence to the grave. But somewhere out there, someone must know more. Elizabeth had raised his mother. There had to be records, people who'd known them, something that could fill in the gaps. Levi made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd start making calls. He'd track down what happened to Elizabeth Hartwell. He'd find out how his mother had lived her life after leaving Wyoming. He'd piece together the story that everyone had tried so hard to bury, not for revenge. Not to judge the choices that had been made, but because his mother deserved to be remembered as whole. As Sarah Boone, who became Sarah Hartwell. As a twin who'd lost her other half too young. As a daughter who'd been loved and then sent away, not out of cruelty, but out of her father's broken inability to cope with his own grief. She deserved better than silence. They all did. The next morning, Levi went back to the barn. Not to clean it out. That job seemed pointless now, a distraction from what really mattered, but to search for anything else that might have been hidden. If Grandpa had kept caskets and letters and journals, what else might be tucked away in forgotten corners? He worked methodically, starting at one end and moving slowly toward the other, opening every trunk, every crate, every drawer in the dusty workbenches that lined the walls. Most of what he found was mundane. Old tools, receipts from decades past, calendars from the 60s and 70s still hanging on nails. But in a locked metal box on a high shelf, hidden behind a stack of paint cans, he found something that changed everything again. The box required bolt cutters to open. Inside was a leather portfolio, the kind lawyers used for important documents. And inside that, carefully preserved in protective sleeves, were papers that told the legal story of what had happened to Sarah Boone. The first document was a letter from Elizabeth Hartwell to James Boone, dated October 15th, 1959. Dear James, I received your telephone call, and I want you to know that I understand. These past 2 years have been unimaginable for you, and I don't judge the choice you're making. Sarah is my niece, and I love her. I will raise her as my own daughter, give her every opportunity, and make sure she knows she's wanted and loved. You asked me not to tell her about Clara, and I'll honor that request, though I think you're wrong. But you're her father, and it's your decision to make. I'll change her last name to Hartwell legally, so she can have a fresh start without questions. She'll be Sarah Hartwell, my daughter. Margaret would understand. She'd want Sarah to have a chance at happiness. I hope someday you'll feel differently and want to be part of her life again. The door will always be open. With love and sadness, Elizabeth. Levi read the letter 3 times, absorbing the implications. Grandpa had asked Elizabeth not to tell Sarah about Clara, had specifically requested that his daughter grow up not knowing she'd been a twin. The cruelty of that decision, even if made from a place of pain, was staggering. The next document was the adoption paperwork. Legal and official, dated November 1959, transferring full custody of Sarah Mae Boone to Elizabeth Rose Hartwell of Billings, Montana. James Boone had signed at the bottom, surrendering his parental rights. The signature was shaky, barely legible, as if his hand had trembled too much to hold the pen steady. Tucked behind the adoption papers was a single sheet of notebook paper. Folded small, covered in Grandpa's handwriting, Levi unfolded it carefully. I cannot look at her without seeing Clara. Every morning Sarah comes down for breakfast, and I see Clara sitting in the chair across from her. Every night when I tuck her in, I expect Clara to be in the other bed, asking for one more story. I hear both their voices when only one of them speaks. I reach for 2 hands when there's only one to hold. Margaret said I needed to be strong for Sarah, that she'd lost her sister and needed her father more than ever. But I'm not strong. I'm broken in ways that can't be fixed. Every time I look at Sarah, I fail her because I'm looking for someone who isn't there. She deserves better than a father who sees her as half of something instead of whole. She deserves a chance to be just Sarah, not Sarah without Clara. Elizabeth can give her that. I can't. God forgive me, I can't. The words were stained with something that might have been water or might have been tears. Levi set the paper down gently, his throat tight. There were more documents in the portfolio. Letters from Elizabeth over the years, updating James on Sarah's progress. Report cards showing that Sarah was a good student, quiet but capable. A photograph from Sarah's high school graduation. Elizabeth must have sent it, showing a young woman who looked so much like Margaret. It was startling. She was smiling, but her eyes were sad, as if even then she knew something was missing from her life without being able to name what it was. And at the very bottom of the portfolio, in an envelope marked "Do Not Open," Levi found 2 birth certificates. One was the original he'd already seen, Sarah Mae Boone, born March 15, 1952. The other was new, issued in Montana in 1960, showing Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, born the same date, but listing Elizabeth Hartwell as the mother and father listed as unknown. His mother had been legally erased. Sarah Boone had ceased to exist, replaced by Sarah Hartwell, a girl with no history and no twin and no connection to the ranch in Wyoming where she'd been born. Levi sat on the barn floor, surrounded by the evidence of his family's systematic destruction, and tried to process what he was learning. His mother had grown up not knowing she'd had a sister, not knowing she'd been sent away, not knowing her father had chosen to erase her rather than deal with his own grief. But had she really not known? Or had she known something, felt something, carried some unnamed loss her whole life? He thought about her again, the mother he'd known, who'd raised him alone after his father died, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, who'd always seemed to have this sadness about her that she couldn't explain. She died when Levi was 28, still young enough that her death felt impossibly unfair. Cancer, same as Margaret, same as her own mother, though she hadn't known it. I feel like I'm missing something, she'd said once near the end, when the pain medication made her philosophical. Like there's supposed to be something else. Someone else. Does that make sense? At the time, Levi had thought she was talking about his father, dead 5 years by then. But now he wondered, had some part of her remembered Clara? Had some deep instinct known she'd been a twin? He found one more document in the portfolio, a letter from Grandpa to Sarah. Dated 1985, never sent. Dear Sarah, You're 33 years old now, and I've never had the courage to contact you. Elizabeth sends me updates sometimes, though I've asked her not to. I know you graduated from college. I know you married a man named William Boone. A strange coincidence, the same last name you were born with, though you don't know that. I know you had a son named Levi. I'm a grandfather, though I'll never meet my grandson. I'll never tell you the truth about who you are and where you came from. I'll never explain why I sent you away, because the truth is I don't have a good explanation. I was drowning and I let you go to save myself. That's not noble. That's not forgivable. That's just what I did. If you're reading this, I'm dead. And you found the caskets, the letters, the truth. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want you to know that I loved you. I loved you as much as I love Clara. But love wasn't enough to overcome my cowardice. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for all of it. Your father, James. Levi folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Grandpa had written to his mother but never sent it. Had kept it all these years, along with everything else, in this metal box in the barn. The pieces were complete now. He understood what had happened and why. Clara had died. Margaret had died. And Grandpa, unable to function through his grief, had sent Sarah away and then spent the rest of his life locked in guilt and silence. Sarah had grown up in Montana, never knowing her true history. She'd married, had Levi, and died, still not knowing she'd been a twin. Grandpa had lived another 60-plus years, never reaching out, never explaining, just building caskets and writing letters and watching time tick away on a pocket watch set to the moment his daughters were born. And now, Levi was the only one left who knew the truth. The last keeper of a secret that had destroyed everyone it touched. But knowing the truth also meant he had a choice. He could let it end here, sell the ranch, scatter these documents to the wind, and move on with his life as if none of this mattered. Or he could do what his mother never got a chance to do. He could find out if there was anyone else out there who remembered Sarah Boone, who remembered the little girl who'd lost her twin and then lost everything else, who might have known her, loved her, kept her memory alive. Elizabeth Hartwell had raised his mother. She'd been the one constant in Sarah's life after everything fell apart. If anyone had kept records, mementos, stories, it would be Elizabeth. Levi pulled out his phone and started searching. Elizabeth Hartwell, Billings, Montana. It took 15 minutes to find an obituary from 2003. She died at 82, survived by one niece, Catherine Morris, residing at Whispering Pines Care Center. Catherine Morris, his mother's cousin, raised alongside her. Someone who would have known Sarah as a child, as a teenager, as an adult. Someone who might have answers to questions Levi hadn't even thought to ask yet. He looked at Dusty, standing patiently in his stall. How do you feel about a road trip to Montana? The horse nickered, which Levi chose to interpret as agreement. Tomorrow he'd start making calls. Tomorrow he'd begin the next phase of this journey, tracking down the last living person who'd known his mother before she was lost to history. Tonight, he'd sit with these documents and try to forgive a grandfather who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Try to understand that sometimes love isn't enough. That sometimes grief breaks people in ways that can't be fixed. And maybe, just maybe, try to forgive himself for never asking his mother the questions that might have led to this truth, while she was still alive, to help him understand it. The phone calls to Montana started early the next morning. Levi sat at the dining table with coffee and a notepad, working his way through care facilities in Billings. On his 5th call, he found her. Whispering Pines Care Center, how may I help you? I'm looking for a resident. Catherine Morris? May I ask who's calling? My name is Levi Boone. He paused, unsure how to explain. I'm family. Her cousin's son. There was a brief silence on the other end. Catherine doesn't get many visitors. Let me transfer you to her floor. 3 transfers later, he was speaking to a nurse who confirmed that Catherine was coherent, mobile, and would probably welcome a call. She gave him Catherine's room number and suggested he call back in an hour after breakfast. Levi spent that hour pacing the house, rehearsing what he'd say. How do you call someone you've never met and ask them about secrets buried 70 years ago? How do you explain that you're unraveling your entire family history and need help making sense of it? When he called back, a woman's voice answered after 2 rings. Hello? Mrs. Morris, my name is Levi Boone. I'm Sarah's son. The voice was clear, strong, with an edge of surprise. My God, Sarah's son. You knew my mother. Knew her? She was my sister in every way that mattered. Elizabeth raised us together. A pause. Why are you calling me now? Sarah's been gone for 30 years. 32, Levi said quietly. And I'm calling because I just found out she wasn't who I thought she was. Another pause, longer this time. You found something? I found everything. The caskets in my grandfather's barn. The letters. The journals, Clara. He took a breath. I need to understand what happened. I need to know if my mother knew the truth. Catherine's voice softened. Come see me. This isn't a conversation for the telephone. They arranged for him to visit in 2 days. That gave Levi time to organize the documents, to prepare himself mentally for the journey, to figure out what questions to ask. But that night, unable to sleep again, he found himself in Grandpa's bedroom. He'd been in here before, of course, but always quickly, grabbing clothes to send to the funeral home, collecting the few valuables for the estate lawyer. He hadn't really searched it. The room was sparse. A bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a lamp and an old Bible, a closet with a few flannel shirts and worn jeans. Nothing remarkable, nothing that suggested a man carrying decades of secrets, but there was a trunk at the foot of the bed, wooden, heavy, with a padlock that looked newer than the trunk itself. Levi had noticed it before but hadn't thought much of it. Now, armed with bolt cutters from the barn, he returned and cut through the lock. Inside were layers of his grandfather's life. Financial records on top, mortgage papers, tax documents, bank statements. Underneath, property deeds going back to the 40s, when Grandpa's father had first bought this land. Deeper still, old letters, photographs, receipts for cattle sales, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax that had long since cracked, an envelope. Heavy paper, the kind used for important documents. Across the front, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, "Do not open." Levi's hands shook as he picked it up. Every instinct told him this was significant, that whatever was inside this envelope was the key to something important. He broke the seal. Inside was a single document, official, embossed with the state seal of Wyoming. A birth certificate, but not just any birth certificate. He'd seen Sarah's original birth certificate already, found it in the barn with all the other papers. This was different. His vision blurred for a moment as his brain tried to process what he was seeing. Birth certificate. State of Wyoming. Female. Born March 15th, 1952. At 3:22 a.m. Name, Sarah May Boone. Parents, James Robert Boone and Margaret Ann Boone. Notes, twin A. And written across the bottom in blue ink, in handwriting, he recognized immediately, because he'd seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter throughout his childhood. This is who I really am, SB Sarah Boone, his mother's handwriting. On her original birth certificate, the room tilted. Levi sat down hard on the floor, still holding the document, staring at those words. This is who I really am. His mother had known. At some point, somehow, she'd discovered the truth about where she came from. She'd found this birth certificate, written that note on it, and then, what? Given it to Grandpa? Hidden it? How had it ended up in this trunk? His mind raced backward through his memories, reassembling his childhood with this new information. His mother, Sarah Hartwell, was actually Sarah Boone, was actually one of the twins, was actually the little girl sent away to Montana, was actually the daughter Grandpa had surrendered because he couldn't bear to look at her, which meant Clara wasn't some distant relative. Clara was his aunt, his mother's identical twin sister. The sibling he'd never known his mother had. The magnitude of it crashed over him like a wave. His entire family history, the story he'd built his identity on, was wrong. His mother hadn't been an only child raised by a kind aunt. She'd been half of a pair, forcibly separated, given away by a father too broken to parent her. And Grandpa hadn't been the distant but decent old man Levi had known. He'd been the father who'd abandoned his own daughter, who'd let her grow up not knowing who she was, who'd attended her funeral 32 years ago and said nothing, revealed nothing, maintained the lie until his dying breath. Levi's memory snagged on that funeral. He'd been 28, still raw from the loss. His mother had died fast, cancer, same disease that had taken Margaret, and Grandpa had driven down for the service. Levi remembered him standing at the grave, stone-faced, unmoved. At the time, Levi had thought Grandpa was just uncomfortable with emotion, being stoic the way old ranchers were, but now he understood. Grandpa had been looking at his daughter's grave, the daughter he'd sent away, the daughter who'd lived her whole life not knowing she'd been a twin, not knowing why she always felt incomplete. "I feel like I'm missing something," she'd said near the end. "Like there's supposed to be something else." Someone else. She'd been missing Clara, missing her twin, missing the other half of herself that had died 66 years ago, and Grandpa had known. Had stood at that funeral knowing exactly what his daughter had been missing and had said nothing. The anger came then, hot and sudden. Levi wanted to scream at someone, wanted to demand explanations from people who were all dead and beyond accountability. The unfairness of it, that he was the last one left, the only one who knew the whole truth, with no one to ask and no one to rage at. But underneath the anger was something else, a terrible creeping understanding of the choices that had been made and why they'd been made. Grandpa had lost Clara, lost Margaret, and found himself with a surviving daughter who was a living reminder of everything he'd lost. In his grief and trauma, he'd made the choice to send her away. To protect himself, yes, but maybe also to protect her. To give her a chance at a life that wasn't haunted by ghosts. Was it the right choice? God, no, it was terrible. It was selfish. It was the action of a man so broken he couldn't think past his own pain. But did Levi understand it? Looking at Margaret's journal entries, reading about the depth of their grief, seeing how Clara's death had destroyed them, did he understand how a person could make such a devastating decision? He didn't want to. He wanted to hold on to his anger. But sitting there on the floor of Grandpa's bedroom, holding his mother's birth certificate with her handwriting on it, he felt his certainty crumbling. His mother had found out the truth somehow, had written on that birth certificate, "This is who I really am." But she'd never told Levi, never explained. Why? Had she confronted Grandpa? Had they come to some understanding? Or had she found out too late, when she was already sick, and decided the truth would be too much for her son to bear? Levi realized with a jolt that he'd been operating under an assumption that his mother had died not knowing about Clara. But what if she had known? What if in her last years she'd discovered everything and chosen to keep it from him? That would explain why Grandpa had this birth certificate, why it was in his trunk, locked away. Maybe his mother had given it to him before she died. Maybe they'd had a conversation Levi knew nothing about. He stood up slowly, legs stiff from sitting on the hard floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark shape of the barn against the starry sky. Everything he thought he knew about his family had been wrong. His mother was Sarah Boone, Clara was his aunt. Grandpa had given away his own daughter, and then lived 60 years with that choice. And Levi was the product of all those secrets. The grandson who'd loved both his mother and his grandfather without knowing the truth about either of them. Who was he if his history was rewritten? If the foundation he'd built his life on was made of lies and omissions? The answer came to him slowly, painfully. He was still himself. Levi Boone, 60 years old, divorced, childless, a ranch hand who'd spent his life moving from place to place because he'd never felt at home anywhere. Maybe that restlessness came from his mother, who'd carried the ghost of her twin her whole life without knowing what she was grieving. Maybe it was in his blood, this sense of incompleteness. But knowing the truth didn't change who he was. It only changed how he understood where he came from. He looked at the birth certificate again, at his mother's handwriting. "This is who I really am. Sarah Boone, twin to Clara Boone, daughter of James and Margaret Boone, born March 15th, 1952, at 3:22 in the morning, 25 minutes before her sister. I know who you are now. Mom, Levi said quietly to the empty room, and I'm going to make sure your story gets told right. Tomorrow he'd drive to Montana. He'd meet Catherine Morris and find out what his mother's life had been like after she was sent away. He'd piece together the years between that adoption in 1959 and her death in 1993. He'd understand how she'd found out the truth and what she'd done with that knowledge. But tonight he stood in his grandfather's bedroom, holding proof that his entire family had been built on grief and secrets and choices that seemed impossible, but had been made anyway. And he tried to find forgiveness for people who were long past needing it, but who maybe deserved it regardless. Levi spent the next day preparing for the journey to Montana. Not the truck. The roads were clear enough this time of year, but something more important. He needed to organize everything he'd found, create a coherent narrative from the fragments. More than that, he needed to understand it himself before he could talk about it with Catherine. He spread everything out on the dining table again. The caskets sat on the floor beside him, too large for the table, but close enough that he could reach in and retrieve items as needed. He sorted the photographs chronologically, watching his family's story unfold in black and white images. Margaret and James on their wedding day, young and hopeful. Margaret pregnant, glowing. The twins as babies, as toddlers, as young girls. Then the photos stopped abruptly in the summer of 1957. The letters he organized by date and author. Grandpa's letters to Clara, spanning those terrible years after her death. Margaret's journal, chronicling the twins' short lives and her own decline. The adoption papers and legal documents that had erased Sarah Boone and created Sarah Hartwell, and the birth certificate with his mother's handwriting on it. He kept coming back to that, kept staring at those words. This is who I really am, and trying to imagine the moment she'd written them. When had she discovered the truth? How? Had Elizabeth finally told her before she died? Had she found documents like Levi had? In Margaret's journal, tucked between pages near the end, Levi found something he'd missed before. A letter, written in a child's unsteady hand, the letters large and carefully formed. Dear Sarah, when I go to heaven, I will wait for you. Don't be sad. We will play together again someday, and it will be fun. I love you more than anything. Love, your sister Clara. Levi had to set it down and walk away. A 7-year-old writing to her twin from her deathbed, trying to comfort her sister even while dying. The letter had never been given to Sarah. Margaret must have kept it, unable to bear giving a 6-year-old such a permanent goodbye. But now Levi had it, and he could give it to Catherine, who could tell him about his mother's life, could help him understand what Sarah had become after being sent away from everything she'd known. He packed carefully. The birth certificate, the letter from Clara, select photographs, Margaret's journal, all of it. He put everything in a leather satchel that had belonged to Grandpa and placed it carefully in the truck's cab where it wouldn't get damaged or lost. The afternoon was spent with Dusty. The horse had been patient these last several days, content with the pasture and the barn, but Levi could tell he was ready for work. Horses were like that. They needed purpose, same as people. We're going on a trip, Levi told him, brushing his coat until it gleamed. Few days on the road. You up for it? Dusty turned his head and looked at Levi with those knowing eyes, and Levi could have sworn the horse understood every word. That evening, Levi walked the property. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and purple. He walked to the barn first, standing in the doorway where he'd stood so many times as a boy, watching Grandpa work. This barn had held secrets for 70 years, had kept Clara's casket hidden, preserved Margaret's words, protected the truth from discovery. Now the secrets were out. The caskets would need to be buried properly. The letters and journal would be preserved, but not hidden. The truth would be told finally to anyone who wanted to hear it. He walked to the house next, going room by room. The kitchen where he'd eaten bologna sandwiches as a kid. The living room where Grandpa used to sit and watch the evening news, rarely speaking, just present. The bedroom upstairs that had been Levi's during summer visits, still holding the same quilt on the bed, and the locked room at the end of the hall. Levi had the bolt cutters in his hand before he consciously decided to use them. The lock gave way easily, and the door swung open. Inside was a shrine, 2 small beds made up with matching quilts, a rocking horse between them, shelves lined with children's books, toys arranged carefully on a low table, drawings tacked to the walls, childish pictures of horses and barns and stick-figure families. Everything preserved exactly as it had been in 1958, frozen in time. This was the twins' room. The room Clara and Sarah had shared. Grandpa had locked it after Margaret died and never opened it again. Never changed anything, just kept it as a memorial to what he'd lost. Levi stood in the doorway for a long time, not entering, just looking. He understood now. The locked door hadn't been about storage or privacy. It had been about pain too great to face, about preserving a moment before everything fell apart, about holding on to something, anything, from a life that had been destroyed. He closed the door gently and left it locked. Some things didn't need to be disturbed. Outside, full dark had fallen. The stars were out in force, thousands of them visible in the clear Wyoming sky, the Milky Way a bright river overhead. These were the stars Grandpa had written to Clara about. The same stars that had watched over this ranch for 100 years, indifferent to human grief. Levi sat on the porch steps, thinking about the journey ahead. It was 300 miles to Billings, mostly highway, but some back roads through country that hadn't changed much in a century. He'd take it slow, stop when he needed to, arrive when he arrived. There was no rush. Catherine wasn't going anywhere. And the truth had waited 70 years. Another few days wouldn't hurt, but underneath the practical considerations was something deeper. This journey was about more than just getting answers. It was about healing, about taking the broken pieces of his family's story and fitting them together in a way that honored everyone involved. His mother, his grandfather, Clara, Margaret, they all deserved to be remembered fully, completely, with all their flaws and choices and pain acknowledged. He thought about forgiveness. Could he forgive Grandpa for sending his mother away? For lying by omission for Levi's entire life? For creating a family built on silence? Maybe understanding helped. Knowing the depth of Grandpa's grief, seeing how it had broken him, that helped. But forgiveness wasn't something you decided to do. It was something that happened slowly, gradually, like water wearing down stone. Sleep came easier that night, though he still woke before dawn. Old habits. He made coffee, watched the sun rise, and loaded the truck. The satchel with the documents went on the passenger seat. A bag with clothes and necessities went in the back. Dusty loaded easily into the trailer, calm as always. Before he left, Levi went back to the barn one more time. He stood looking at the 2 caskets now uncovered, visible. They'd be here when he got back. He'd figure out what to do with them, probably bury them properly, give Clara and Margaret a resting place on the land they'd loved. But that was for later. For now he had a journey to make. The drive took 2 days. Levi could have done it in 1, pushing hard, but he didn't see the point. He took his time, pulled over when he saw something interesting, stopped for meals at small-town diners where the coffee was strong and the pie was homemade. The landscape changed as he drove north. The high plains gave way to rolling hills, then to the valleys of southern Montana. He passed ranches that looked like Grandpa's place, weathered buildings, split-rail fences, cattle grazing peacefully. This was the country his mother had grown up in. These roads she'd traveled. This sky she'd looked at while not knowing she'd once had a sister who looked exactly like her. He spent the night at a campground outside Red Lodge, cooking dinner over a fire while Dusty grazed nearby. The stars here were just as bright as they'd been in Wyoming. Levi lay in his sleeping bag and looked up at them, thinking about Clara telling Sarah she'd wait for her in heaven, thinking about how love persisted even when everything else fell apart. The next morning, he drove into Billings. It was larger than he'd expected, 50,000 people, maybe more, but still had that Montana feel. Mountains visible in the distance, big sky overhead, everything spread out and unhurried. Whispering Pines Care Center was on the north side of town, a modern building trying to look homey with flower boxes and a covered front porch. Levi parked, checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. and grabbed the satchel. Inside, the facility smelled like every care center he'd ever visited, antiseptic and air freshener, and something underneath that might have been age or resignation. The receptionist directed him to Catherine's room on the second floor, and he took the stairs to give himself time to prepare. Room 237. He knocked twice. "Come in," a woman's voice called, and Levi opened the door. The woman sitting by the window was 72, according to the obituary he'd found, but she could have passed for 60. Bright eyes, silver hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a cardigan despite the warmth. She turned as he entered and studied him for a long moment. "You have Sarah's eyes," she said finally. "I'd know them anywhere." Levi crossed the room and extended his hand. "Mrs. Morris, thank you for seeing me." "Catherine, please." She shook his hand firmly. "And I should thank you for coming. I've been thinking about Sarah a lot these past couple days, since you called, wondering what you found that brought you all the way here." He sat in the chair across from her and opened the satchel. "I found everything," he said quietly. "The whole story, or at least most of it. I was hoping you could help me fill in the rest." Catherine's eyes glistened. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to ask." Catherine gestured to the table between them. "Show me what you found." Levi pulled out the photographs first. The one of Margaret with both twins as babies. The one from summer 1957, the last photo taken before Clara got sick. Catherine took them gently, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at faces from 70 years ago. "I never saw these," she whispered. "Elizabeth kept everything about Sarah's early life locked away. Said it was too painful to revisit. You knew about Clara?" "Not at first. Not for years." Catherine looked up from the photographs. "Sarah came to live with us in November 1959. I was 7 years old. She was 6. My mother, Elizabeth, told me Sarah was my cousin, that her mother had died and her father couldn't take care of her, so she was coming to live with us permanently. That was all I knew. What was she like?" "When she first arrived?" Catherine's expression grew distant, remembering. Silent. She didn't speak for almost a year. Not a single word. She'd nod or shake her head if you asked her direct questions, but that was it. The doctors said it was trauma, that she'd witnessed something or lost something so profound, that her mind had shut down the part that makes words. Levi pulled out Margaret's journal and opened it to one of the entries about the twins' connection. He handed it to Catherine, who read slowly, tears forming in her eyes. They were that close. Closer. Margaret wrote that they were like one soul in 2 bodies. When Clara died, Sarah lost half of herself. That explains so much. Catherine wiped her eyes. Sarah was like a ghost those first few years. She ate when told to, slept when told to, went to school and did her work, but there was nothing behind her eyes, like she was waiting for something that never came. My mother would cry at night, worried that Sarah would never recover. Worried that we'd made a mistake bringing her here. But she did recover. Eventually. It took until she was maybe 10 years old before she started talking again. Even then, she was quiet, reserved. She had nightmares for years, would wake up screaming, reaching for someone who wasn't there. My mother would hold her until the crying stopped, but Sarah never explained what the dreams were about. Levi handed her Clara's letter, the one written in a child's shaky handwriting. Catherine read it and had to set it down, pressing her hand to her mouth. She never got to read this? I don't think so. It was hidden in Margaret's journal. Oh, Sarah, Catherine's voice broke. She needed this. She needed to know Clara hadn't just left her, that her sister had said goodbye. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what had been lost. Then Catherine continued. Sarah grew up. She did well in school, brilliant girl actually. Loved books, loved learning. She was studying to be a teacher when she met your father at a county fair. William Boone, she smiled sadly. The coincidence of the last name. We all remarked on it. Sarah said maybe it was fate bringing her back to who she was supposed to be, though she didn't know how right she was. Did she ever ask about her past? About Wyoming? About her father? Constantly, when she finally started talking again. But my mother always said the same thing, that her father loved her but couldn't raise her alone, that her mother had died of cancer, that starting fresh in Montana was the best thing for everyone. Sarah eventually stopped asking, but I don't think she ever stopped wondering. Levi pulled out his mother's birth certificate, the one with her handwriting on it. He handed it to Catherine, who stared at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" "In Grandpa's trunk. In a sealed envelope marked 'Do not open.' My God." Catherine traced the words with her finger. "This is who I really am." She looked up at Levi. "I gave this to her about a year before she died. My mother had passed away in 2003, and I was going through her things. I found a box hidden in the back of her closet. Inside was Sarah's original birth certificate, adoption papers, letters from James Boone, everything Elizabeth had hidden for 40 years. You told her the truth." "I called her, told her I'd found something she needed to see. She drove up from Wyoming. You must have been about 27 at the time, and I showed her everything." Catherine's eyes filled with tears again. She just sat there staring at that birth certificate, reading her real name over and over. Sarah May Boone, twin A, and then she wrote those words on it. "This is who I really am," like she'd finally found the missing piece. What did she do with the information? She took the certificate, said she needed to think, needed to process. She asked me everything I knew about her early life, about Clara, about what had happened. I told her what little my mother had told me over the years, that she'd had a twin sister who died of leukemia, that her mother had died of grief and cancer, that her father had sent her away because he couldn't bear the reminder. Catherine looked directly at Levi. She asked me if I thought her father had ever loved her. I told her what my mother always said, that James Boone loved Sarah so much it destroyed him, that sending her away was the act of a broken man trying to give his daughter a chance at a life he couldn't provide. Did she believe that? I don't know. She left that day with the birth certificate, and I never saw her again. She called once, maybe 2 months later, said she'd driven to Wyoming to see her father, to confront him. Levi's heart clenched. She went to see Grandpa? She did. But she told me she couldn't do it. She got to the ranch, sat in the driveway for an hour, and then drove away. Said she looked through the window and saw an old man who looked so lonely and sad that she couldn't add to his pain by demanding explanations for choices made 60 years ago. So she never talked to him. Not according to what she told me. She said she'd made peace with it, that some questions don't need answers, that she'd rather remember her life as Sarah Hartwell, the mother who raised you, the teacher who helped children, than torture herself over Sarah Boone, the girl who'd been lost. Catherine reached across and took Levi's hand. But I think she was lying. I think it haunted her until the day she died. A small wooden music box sat on Catherine's dresser. She stood slowly and retrieved it, bringing it back to her chair. This was Sarah's, she said, winding the key. One of the few things she had from her early childhood. My mother saved it for her. The music box opened and a delicate tune began to play. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Both girls had one, Catherine explained. Identical music boxes, gifts from their mother. When Sarah left Wyoming, this came with her. Clara's was buried with her. Sarah kept this one her whole life. When she died, she left it with me. Said if anyone ever came looking for the truth, I should give it to them. She handed the music box to Levi. She knew someone would find the caskets eventually. She knew the truth would come out, and she wanted whoever found it to have this. To know that she existed, that she was loved, that even though she was sent away and renamed and her history was erased, she was still Sarah Boone, still Clara's twin, still part of a family that loved her even if they loved her badly. Levi held the music box as it played, and for the first time since finding those caskets in the barn, he cried. They sat together in Catherine's room as afternoon light slanted through the windows. The music box had wound down, its tune fading to silence, but Levi kept it cradled in his hands like something precious that might break if handled roughly. "Tell me more about her," he said finally. "About who she was, what she loved." Catherine smiled, the sadness in her eyes mixing with warmth. "She loved children, That's why she became a teacher. She'd say that every child deserved to know they mattered, that they were seen and valued. I think, she paused, considering her words carefully. I think she was trying to give other children what she'd lost. That certainty of belonging. She was a good mother, Levi said quietly. Even working 2 jobs after Dad died, she always made time. Always listened. She learned that from my mother. Elizabeth wasn't Sarah's birth mother, but she loved her fiercely. Made sure Sarah knew every single day that she was wanted, that she belonged with us, that our family was her family. Catherine's voice wavered. But there was always something Sarah couldn't quite name. A loneliness that persisted no matter how much love surrounded her. Clara, Catherine agreed. Though Sarah didn't know that's what it was until she saw that birth certificate. She called me the night after she found out and she was crying. Not angry crying or sad crying, but relief. She said, I finally understand why I've always felt like half of something. Because I am half of something. I had a twin and she died and no one ever told me. Levi thought about his mother's death. Cancer, fast and brutal. He'd sat with her in those final weeks, watching her fade, listening to her talk about her life in that way dying people do when they're trying to make sense of everything before the end. She talked about feeling incomplete, he said. I thought she meant Dad, thought she was lonely without him. Maybe she was lonely for both of them. For your father, and for the sister she never got to mourn properly. Catherine reached into a drawer beside her chair and pulled out a small photo album. My mother kept this. Pictures of Sarah growing up with us. She handed it to Levi, and he opened it carefully. The pages were filled with photographs spanning decades. Sarah, as a young girl with pigtails, standing next to Catherine in front of a schoolhouse. Sarah as a teenager, thin and serious, holding a stack of books. Sarah at her high school graduation, smiling but her eyes sad. Sarah at her wedding, beautiful in a simple dress. Standing beside a man Levi recognized from the few photographs he had of his father, and in every picture, even the ones where she was smiling, there was that quality Catherine had mentioned. Like she was looking for something just beyond the frame. She used to stare at mirrors, Catherine said softly, especially when we were teenagers. She'd stand there for long stretches, just looking at her reflection. I asked her once what she was doing, and she said she was trying to remember something. Trying to see something that should be there but wasn't. Her twin. Her twin, Catherine confirmed. The other face that matched hers. The person who'd shared everything with her for the first 6 years of her life, and then vanished. Catherine turned to another page in the album. This one showed Sarah in her 30s, holding a baby. Levi recognized himself. Couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in a blue blanket. She sent me this picture, Catherine said. Wrote on the back that becoming a mother had changed everything. That for the first time in her life, she felt complete. Because she had you, Levi had to look away. His mother had filled the emptiness left by Clara with him. Had poured all that love and loss and longing into raising him. No wonder she'd been so attentive, so present, so determined that he knew he was valued. She'd been giving him what she'd lost. There's something else, Catherine said. She stood and walked to her closet, returning with a large plastic bin. My mother saved everything Sarah left behind when she got married and moved away. Childhood drawings, school papers, journals. Sarah never asked for them back, and after she died, I couldn't bear to throw them away. I've kept them all these years, not knowing what to do with them. She set the bin on the floor between them. They're yours now. Your mother's history. The part she lived after leaving Wyoming. Levi knelt beside the bin and lifted the lid. Inside was a treasure trove of a life. Journals filled with a young girl's handwriting. Report cards showing straight A's. Drawings of horses and mountains and stick-figure families. And underneath everything, a worn rag doll with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. He pulled it out, his hands shaking. The doll was identical to the one in Clara's casket. Same calico dress, same basic construction. But this one had Sarah embroidered on the hem. The twins each had one, Catherine explained. Margaret made them. When Sarah left Wyoming, this came with her. It was one of the only things she had from her life before. Levi held the doll carefully, thinking about 2 little girls each holding their identical dolls, playing together, sleeping side by side. never imagining they'd be separated. Thank you, he managed to say, for keeping all of this, for caring enough to preserve her story. Sarah was my sister in every way that mattered, Catherine said firmly. We weren't blood, but we were family. She deserved to know the truth about where she came from, and you deserved to know who she really was. They talked for another hour, Catherine sharing stories about Sarah's life, her struggles in school to overcome her early silence, her talent for music. She'd played piano beautifully, her kindness, her fierce loyalty, her quiet strength, the way she'd handled adversity with grace, even when life threw the hardest punches. Did she ever regret not confronting Grandpa? Levi asked as he was preparing to leave. Catherine considered the question. I don't think so. She told me once that holding on to anger toward James would have poisoned her life, that he'd made his choice out of unbearable grief, and she'd made hers, to live fully despite not knowing her whole story. She said forgiveness didn't require confrontation. Sometimes it just required understanding. That sounds like her. She was wiser than most people twice her age. Catherine stood and embraced him. You have her eyes, but you have her heart too. I can tell. The way you came all this way to understand, to piece together the truth, that's Sarah's gift to you. The belief that truth matters, even when it hurts. Levi picked up the bin, the music box, and the satchel with all the documents. Will you come to Wyoming? When I bury the caskets properly, when I lay them to rest, will you come? Catherine's eyes filled with tears. I'd be honored. They exchanged information, promised to stay in touch, and Levi left feeling both heavier and lighter than when he'd arrived. Heavier with the weight of all he now knew, lighter because he finally understood not just what had happened, but who his mother had been despite it all. As he walked to his truck, where Dusty waited patiently in the trailer, Levi realized something profound. His family hadn't been destroyed by secrets. It had been transformed by them, broken and reformed into something different but no less real. And now, finally, everyone's truth would be told. 3 weeks later, on a clear morning in early April, Levi stood on the hillside, overlooking his grandfather's ranch, with a shovel in his hands and peace in his heart. The journey back from Montana had given him time to think, to process, to decide what needed to be done. The ranch wouldn't be sold. That decision had come easily, once he understood its significance. This land held his family's story, all of it, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss. Selling it would be like erasing them all over again. Instead, he'd called the lawyer and worked out a payment plan for the debts. It would take years, but Levi had years. He'd make the ranch work again, bring it back to life, turn it into something his mother would have been proud of. But first, he needed to give his family the goodbye they deserved. He'd spent 2 days digging graves on the hillside, not in the town cemetery where Margaret rested. That place held too much loneliness. Here, overlooking the valley where the morning sun painted the mountains gold, where antelope grazed and hawks circled overhead. Here they would rest together. Catherine had driven down from Montana the day before, bringing with her a quilt that Levi hadn't known existed. Margaret had made it during her pregnancy with the twins, she'd explained. 2 trees growing side by side, their branches intertwined, identical blossoms on each. Elizabeth had saved it all these years, and Catherine had preserved it after her mother's death. It belongs with them, Catherine had said. And Levi agreed. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Father Murphy from Clearwater arrived in his dusty sedan. He was an old man himself, pushing 80, but he'd agreed immediately when Levi called. Every soul deserves proper rest, he'd said, even if it comes 70 years late. Walter Hayes came too, representing the old-timers who'd known the Boones back in the 50s. He stood with his hat in his hands, face weathered as old leather, eyes sad but understanding. Levi and Walter carried the caskets from the barn to the hillside. First Clara's, small and heartbreaking, then Margaret's, larger but no less tragic. They placed them gently in the earth Levi had prepared. Catherine opened Clara's casket one last time. Inside lay all the mementos of a too-short life. The rag doll, the baby shoes, the letters from a father who'd loved her past death itself. She added the music box, winding it one last time. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star" played softly as she closed the lid. "So you won't be alone," she whispered. "So you'll have something to remind you that Sarah loved you too." In Margaret's casket, Levi placed his mother's wedding ring, the one she'd worn until the day she died. The one that had been in the box of her belongings he'd never quite known what to do with. Next to it, he laid the photographs Catherine had given him, showing Sarah's life after Wyoming. "Growing up, getting married, becoming a mother. So you can see," he said quietly, "so you can know that Sarah had a good life, that she was loved and cared for, even if it wasn't by you." Catherine draped Margaret's quilt over both caskets before they lowered them, the two trees forever intertwined. The twin blossoms, identical and eternal. Father Murphy spoke simply about love that transcends death, about the pain of separation and the promise of reunion, about how grief can break us but also transform us into something stronger if we let it. His words were kind and honest, acknowledging the tragedy while honoring the love that had survived it. When he finished, Catherine spoke. "Sarah May Boone, you were my sister and my friend. You lived with grace and strength despite everything that was taken from you. I hope wherever you are, you've found Clara again. I hope you're whole." Walter surprised everyone by stepping forward. James Boone was a good man who made a hard choice in impossible circumstances. He wasn't perfect. He was broken. But he loved his daughters more than he could bear, and sometimes that's the most tragic thing of all. Levi spoke last. "Mom, Grandpa, Clara, Margaret, I never knew most of you, and the ones I did know I didn't really understand. But I understand now. You were human. You were hurting. You did the best you could with pain that would have destroyed anyone. I forgive you for the secrets. I forgive you for the silence. And I promise your story won't be forgotten." They filled the graves together, taking turns with the shovel. When it was done, Levi placed a marker he'd commissioned from a mason in town. Simple granite engraved with careful words. "Clara May Boone, 1952-1958, beloved daughter and sister. Margaret Ann Boone, 1928-1959, beloved wife and mother. Together at last, forever remembered," and beside it a second marker, "Sarah May Boone Hartwell, 1952-93, twin to Clara, daughter to Margaret and James, mother to Levi. You were loved more than you knew." The ceremony ended as the sun reached its peak. Father Murphy left with promises to visit again. Walter shook Levi's hand and said simply, "You did right by them." Catherine stayed for 3 more days, helping Levi sort through the barn, organize the house, plan for the future. They talked late into the nights, sharing stories, filling in gaps, creating a complete picture of a family torn apart and now, finally, brought back together in memory. On her last evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Dusty grazed nearby, content with his new permanent home. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. "Run the ranch, fix it up. Maybe take in rescue horses, give them a place to heal, same way this place is healing me." He paused. "And I'm going to write it all down, the whole story. So if anyone ever wonders about the Boones, they'll know the truth. Sarah would like that. I think Grandpa would too, in his own way." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Before Catherine left the next morning, she gave Levi one more thing, a photograph she'd kept in her wallet for 30 years. Sarah and Catherine as teenagers, arms around each other, both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. "So you remember," she said, "that despite everything, there was joy, there was love, there was life lived fully, even in the shadow of loss." Levi placed the photograph on the mantel beside the pocket watch, which still ticked steadily away, marking time that no longer felt like a countdown to nothing but rather a celebration of moments lived. That evening, he walked up to the graves on the hillside one last time. The fresh-turned earth was already settling. In a few weeks, grass would grow. In a few months, wildflowers would bloom. In a few years, you might not even know the ground had been disturbed, but Levi would know. And he would come here regularly, tend the graves, tell them about his life, share the ranch's progress. He would keep them company the way Grandpa had kept Clara company through letters, but without the isolation, without the silence. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red and purple. Somewhere up there, Levi thought, maybe Clara and Sarah were together again. Maybe Margaret held them both. Maybe even Grandpa had found peace, reunited with the family he'd loved too much and too poorly. Dusty nickered from the pasture, calling Levi back to the present. Back to work that needed doing, fences that needed mending, a life that needed living. Levi took one last look at the graves, then turned toward home. Behind him, the stones stood silent in the gathering dusk. Ahead, the ranch house glowed with warm light from windows he'd left open. And all around, the land that had held so many secrets now held only peace. The barn doors stood open, letting in the evening breeze. Inside, where caskets had once hidden in darkness, there was only space now. Space for new memories, space for healing, space for life to continue. Carrying the past forward, but no longer weighed down by it, and on the mantel, the pocket watch ticked on. 3:47, the moment Clara was born. The moment it all began, the moment Levi had decided he would choose to remember not as the beginning of tragedy, but as the beginning of love. Because that's what it had been, really. Two babies born minutes apart, loved fiercely by parents who did their best, becoming twins who shared a connection that transcended even death. That was the story he would tell. That was the truth he would preserve. Not a story of secrets and silence, but a story of love that persisted through impossible circumstances. And in the quiet of that Wyoming evening, with the stars beginning to emerge overhead, Levi Boone finally felt like he'd come home.